So I'm going to talk about design in and data capitalism. And what do I mean about when I use those terms? Well, I'm going to come back to that. But sometimes I feel like there is a tendency when you work with design in public sector to not address the elephant in the room, that we're operating in a global market economy that inevitably will shape cultures and shape logics and shape how we understand specific elements of what we're doing, what is right and what is wrong. Capitalism exists, it is there, and it affects us. And where what I'm going to argue here is that we've moved into a new, not a new phase of capitalism, but sort of another economic understanding that has capitalist undertones when it comes to data as a resource. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some key concepts here. Datafication and also resistance, and some of the insights that I've drawn from working in close proximity with designers and with people working to realize, implement, or for that matter, question data as sort of a resource in public welfare. But I'm going to start off as a political scientist, and now Ruth Lund, at least you have seen me done this before, so bear with me. I'm going to present you with a story. This is a story that I've taken from Nobel laureate Amartya Sen. And basically, it's a story about three children: child A, child B, child C. Each child lives in the forest, and each child wants to have a violin that is positioned here in the forest, but only one of the children can have it. So we have child A, child B, and child C. All of them want to have this violin, but only one can have it. So my question to you is, who should have it? A, B, or C? Kalle, who should have it? A, B, or C? We need to come to a decision.
C.
C, who said that? Kim?
Yeah, man.
Why? Why should C have it?
Why not? It's beautiful.
Yeah, you go by looks. Perfect. Kalle, do you have a point on who should have it?
I think they should share it, all of them.
Okay, so you're now implying that there are other rules than the one that I set up. You said one could have it. You said that you share it. Okay, there we go. Well, the point here is that it's hard to make a decision around allocation of resources before we know anything about the context where we're supposed to allocate something. So I'm gonna prescribe some parameters to this scenario. Let's say that child A can play the violin. Every time the child A gets his hands or her hands on the violin, beautiful music appears. And people in the forest feel that, hey, this is sort of a sophisticated environment. The forest is not that bad. It's actually pretty nice living here. So child A argument for getting the violin is that, hey, I can play it. I make beautiful music. Child B, on the other hand, built the violin. Child B didn't pay anything for the materials, but went around in the forest and found stones and sticks and spider webs and managed to put together a violin. Child B has no idea how to play it, but hey, the argumentation for child B is, I built it, I should have it. Child C, on the other hand, has no other toys or instruments. We could say that child C is poor, and child C says that I would really like to have this violin so I could have something, so I could compare myself to others, something material, so that I feel that I'm more an equal to the other people in the forest that actually has some form of wealth. Maybe child C could learn to play the violin. We're not sure, but that's nevertheless child C's argument. So I pose the question again, who should have the violin? Is it still C, Kim, or have you changed your mind?
Man.
Still C?
Still C.
Do you still come back to your original position of the aesthetics of child C, or do you have other arguments?
Well, that's the first one, but the second one is that child C can learn.
Okay. Kalle, have you changed your mind?
No, I think they can share it because they can not play. Will not play it all day. I think you play a violin for maybe 30 minutes as a child maximum, and then you can have share it together. You can have music all the time. So one can play, one can learn, and one one will probably learn to play
Okay.
as well.
Well, here we have the policy designer at work. He's already set up a policy for this. Anyone else want to argue for one specific child? Lars Boström, who do you feel should have it? Sorry to call you out.
Well, I think child C should have it then, because I would say they would all be more equal then. They would share the knowledge and spread it in the group.
Yeah,
So,
I hear you. A utilitarian perspective. Henrik principally would say B. Okay. Anyone else rooting for B? The entrepreneur in the group? Well, the point here, we could do it like this first. In the chat, please indicate which one you want to vote for, because that's how we solve dilemmas like this in a democracy. All options could be good. Like Kalle did, we can sort of envision solutions for how we could reallocate this so it becomes good for everyone. But in a democracy, there are winners and losers. I see here that Ferg says A because more people will benefit from nice music. Yep. Good, Ferg. I think it could be a tie between B and C here. So this is basic politics. This is a lot of what we do in political science. We started this process. But also what you started to do here, Kalle specifically, but also Lars, is that you started to use your own insights and your own ideas and your own experience to sort of model expectations. What could happen here? And what I want to talk about now when I'm talking about data capitalism is that we have sort of locked into one specific path of what we want to do with data as a resource. And that process of locking into that specific mindset and a specific ontology, I argue, and a lot of people with me argue, it will be, if not threatening to democracy, will limit how we view democracy as sort of a underlying basis for society. So the core question that I want to talk about now, and I will get back to the children later on, is how citizen data defined and understood as a resource in the mechanisms of welfare administration within a data capitalist logic. Basically talking about how do we view data from a specifically Nordic context, I would say, and what does this digital data, what do we expect it to do, and what effects that does have on how we shape our services, how we shape our systems, and how we shape our thinking. I'm also then later on going to, in a sort of epilogue, talk a little bit about resistance, because I think that the current development that we're seeing, if we believe in sort of a democratic baseline for society and democratic baseline for digitalization, we should question and resist some of the patterns that are showing itself in the digitalization discourse. So lastly, I'm going to talk about how could or should design be mobilized in breaking down and reformulating a more democratic and care-centered understanding of data as a democratic artifact. This is a lot of academia mumbo jumbo, but I'm doing this because I'm also going to relate back to a few researchers that I think are central in sort of shaping an alternative understanding of what data is and could be in a welfare context. A few years ago, Oscar will have seen this, and I'm pretty sure I've showed it to Henrik Svensson several times. Well, I went around and did talks around critical data studies. And 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, when I showed this slide, first of all, TikTok would not have been in there. It would have been Amazon or something else. I showed this slide and I say, do you use any of these services on a daily basis? And people in the audience, usually it would be middle managers in municipality or regions and stuff like that, will say, yeah, we use these services. And then I would ask, what do you pay for them? And most people say, I don't pay anything, they're free. If I ask that question today, of course, everyone will say, we pay with our data. And these companies have sort of shaped a business model where they take our data and they translate it and transform it into monetary value from them, usually using ad systems for placing ads and stuff like that. This is not news to anyone now. We have sort of normalized this sort of relationship between us and these companies. We understand that they take our data. We understand sort of what we're doing with the data. We might not agree with everything, but there's sort of been a contract between people in general and this sort of data-driven commodified logic. Same goes for variables. I mean, there's been sort of a normalization with us sharing data about our health and our position with companies, and sometimes for good reasons. I use a watch like that, and man, it's awesome sometimes, and it's almost addictive. But on the other hand, I mean, we know the backsides. We did the same thing with the positioning and data of our children. Pokemon Go, when that was released, there was a huge debate around, well, do we really want companies to position where our children moves within a vicinity or in a geography? Today, I mean, it's obvious. I put a watch on my daughter whenever she goes out, so I can position her. But obviously, that data then also can be used by someone else. There is a transactional nature here. And same goes, I mean, with our love preferences. Initially, when we started seeing this sort of data-driven dating apps, people were talking about, well, what happens now when we sort of we give our data on our preferences for a partner to a third party? What happens sort of with ad situations, stuff like that? But now it's been normalized. Now it's sort of a state where, okay, we sort of accept that, and we have sort of moved into a state where that's normal. And I'm not putting any judgment in it. I'm saying that's a process of normalization where we first say, hey, do we really want to give this up? And then we sort of find a state where, okay, well, maybe it's fine. There's a term called surveillance capitalism that was coined by Zuboff in a series of articles, where basically what she talks about is, well, what's happening here is the commodification of personal data by corporations. Data equals money for them, so then they can commodify it, but we sort of get a value back from that. This leads to sort of a logic among companies. Zuboff argues that for one, you want to access more data, because more data means more opportunities. There's a drive towards more and more data extraction and analysis, and that's what, I mean, a lot of data-driven companies want. They want more data, basically. It also leads to a new form of contracts, both in a legal sense that we agree that we give more data to companies, but also the social contract that I mentioned, that I mean, we know that we're being watched. I know that my Google Home system listens to me, but I sort of, in the name, for the sake of convenience and the sake of practicalities, I sort of agree with it. Henrik Passman recommends Zuboff here in the chat. Definitely. I'm going to also post some links related to some of the researchers that I relate to. And thirdly, Zuboff says that, but also it leads to an increased individualization, because the way that these companies, we talked about Pokemon Go and we talked about Tinder and Grindr or whatever, it's about the individual experience between me and the screen and in the backend of database. But it's very individualistic. It's not a question about the collective, or the subject is always individual, which basically means that you tailor a service based on the individual needs in order to get more data. This is sort of the key baselines of surveillance capitalism. And we all know that this exists, and we can problematize it. Moving from this to what I call, and people with me call, data capitalism, is that you sort of can see that in this trend of surveillance capitalism, there are some elements. These elements that we're talking about here, more data, new contracts, individualization, it sort of feeds into a larger social and political cultural shift that we're seeing, which all in different ways relates to technology and data. This is not news to anyone, but when we sort of lay them up, each one beside each other, and we talk about them in relationship to welfare, something happens. So first of all, then we can talk about what Zuboff talks here about, surveillance capitalism. Here we see this commodified logic. There is this transactional nature of data. I give my data away and I hope that I get something in return. I mean, it might not be an equal transactional situation, but we understand the logics of it. There's also a process in society towards this tech determinism, meaning that digitalization is seen as a force of nature. We see it all the time in public discourse. Oh, digitalization is going to happen whether we like it or not, like it's an avalanche coming against us. It is like detaches digitalization from humans. It's almost like it's the seasons. And the same goes there with like a focus on big data and databases, that you want to sort of stress that we need a lot of data, because if we need a lot of data, then we're prepared for digitalization when it comes. And then also a normalization of datafication. And I'm going to get back to that term, but it basically has to do with accepting that everything should be data. If it can be measured, then it should be measured. And if we don't measure it, then it's unethical. There is a very very brief but interesting book by Adrian Daub that is called What Tech Calls Thinking, which I recommend highly. I recommend it because it sort of tracks the shift from before and after the IT bubble. Because before the IT bubble, there was within the tech industry a different kind of idealism, where even though a lot of startup companies today in the Silicon Valley area still believe in changing the world and so forth, they were not that focused on making money before the IT bubble burst. After the IT bubble, if you wanted to get funding, if you wanted to have business angels giving you money, you needed to precisely say, I'm going to make money for you. And that shift has been really interesting, because then also that has feeded into sort of this tech determinism, that tech is going to happen. We can help you prepare for that, but you need to pay us, which is Arjen Daub writes very intricate about. And lastly, sort of tying into a broader social shift that we've been seeing for the last 40 years is sort of this neoliberal and I mean, the neoliberal ideology and philosophy around decision making, how decisions are made in society, building on the thoughts of Wendy Brown and thinkers like that. So we see this sort of consolidation of interpretation and knowledge. I mean, who decides around data is the data expert. I mean, data scientists today are sort of the magicians, the people who will be, who knows the truth, the oracles of our age, like sort of like the management consultants were 25 years ago. We also see sort of a legitimation of social, economic, and legal control. Get a question here from Henrik Parmat. Are we talking about the IT bubble of the late 90s, early 20s? Yes, that's the one. Thank you very much, Henrik. And also a solution-oriented mindset. We talk about IT solutions. We want to solve things. And in this sort of neoliberal ideology, philosophy of decision-making, we go out and sort of search for problems to solve. And that has sort of become a virtue of its own, finding problems to solve. There is a researcher called Bucky who talks about what is the problem represented to be, which looks at, I mean, problem solving in relationship to sort of a neoliberal or capitalist order, where problem framing becomes such an important and powerful tool for how we understand our role in organizations and our role in society. Two books that I would like to mention here is one called Revolutionary Mathematics about Justin Jock, which looks at statistics, AI, and capitalism, and what happens sort of when these three spheres emerge with each other. But also a dissertation that by Adla Ivanovic, that's called The Regime of Digital Coloniality, which also takes sort of the same approach as a Foucauldian approach, but talks more about databases and or the fascination with how truth is supposed to be hidden somewhere in databases, and how sort of a neoliberal understanding of I mean, quick and easy fixes relates to that. So here we have different forms of elements or trends in society that we see going on. We have for the commodified logics of data. We have the tech determinism, where I mean, it's predetermined that technology is going to happen and AI is going to come over us, and it's sort of detached from society. It's just going to happen by nature. And then sort of the old classical neoliberal ideology and decision making, which we all, I mean, have a relationship to, and see that, I mean, obviously it's something that we lived with since the 80s. And these combined form what research today sees as sort of data capitalism feeding ground. It has the elements of surveillance capitalism, but it's sort of broader because it then talks a lot about logics of what data is or is not, and how that rationale in different ways affects organizations, and specifically how it affects organizations that might have a democratic mission, a municipality, a region, or a government. Because in the same way that neoliberal approaches shaped new public management in the 80s and 90s, this form of data capitalist mindset is now also shaping how we do digitalization in the public sector today. So we have sort of this idea of data as an intangible or potential resource. It could do stuff, because we've seen that big companies like Alphabet or Meta or Twitter, they do stuff with their data. So there is something there. Also, that technology as sort of the means of production for this resource. Well, we need to implement data-driven tools in order to be a data-driven organization. Without data, we're not data-driven organization, basically. So, I mean, technology then becomes sort of a discussion around, I mean, taking care of data as a resource. And also a social order dictating how resources should be used and who should have a say over it. And it also goes back to my point around computer scientists being sort of the oracles or the wizards of today. We expect them to sort of sort things out. We go out and we employ computer scientists in municipalities and regions because, I mean, they're going to tell us the truth. So how does this affect the public sector? Well, that's pretty much my research. And I want to be clear that I don't think that it necessarily always affects the public sector in a bad way. It doesn't necessarily affect it in a good way either. It affects it, and we need to be sort of aware of that and know and acknowledge those sort of processes. So what I'm going to talk about here, although I might sound a little cynical at moments, I want to sort of make clear that my agenda here is that I think that we need to talk about it. Then, of course, I'm going to have a point about resistance in the end. But for this section, at least, bear in mind that what I'm trying to focus on here is sort of acknowledging that these trends exist. As I said, in the private sector, user data is basically money. You can have a business model and transfer it into money. But the question here is, but what is user data in the public sector then? Is it like taxpayer money? Is it like taxes? If I pay taxes, I expect something back, and I'll get sad or angry if I see that Region Värmland or Forshaga kommun, where I live, if they don't do good things with my taxpayer money, I'm going to get upset. It should be the same thing with data. Or is data more like a vote in a general election, that it says something about me and my role in the world? That has not really been cleared out. There have been researchers like Shadowski that has argued that data is labor, that it's something we do. Data as capital, of course, is something that's been covered quite a lot. But where we have sort of been standing and talking in circles, basically, I believe, for at least the past 7 or 8 years, is that there is no conceptualization of data as a resource within the public administration. We're not quite sure what it is. At the same time, we have this sort of push towards data-driven technology, and the public sector is saying, hey, let's implement AI, let's implement RPA systems and so forth, with very little consideration around data as a resource. Kalle puts a question here in the chat. Do you think that the public sector should use citizen data as a commodity and sell it? As a way, for example, to lower taxes for the citizens or boost the public services? I think that politicians should think about that, because today, and I'm going to come back to that, there is no ideology in this. It's really difficult to sort of say what is left and right in the digitalization politics. It's super easy in educational politics, in energy politics. But as there is no left and right, of course you could do it if you sort of dig down, but there is no default left and right in political parties. I think they should ask that question. I'm pretty sure some politicians would love it and some people would hate it. I would love to know what I'm voting for. That's my position. I would like to know, okay, can I vote for that guy over there, and something would happen. Because this, I mean, there's good and bad in your statement there, Kalle. But it all depends on, going back to the children and the violin, where you come from, where you sort of see how should resources in society be reallocated. And today there is not that discussion. And one of the things, I think, going back to the slide that we're on right now, is that we have sort of pushed out a lot of data-driven technology without doing sort of this Adam Smith or Marx process of defining what is this, what is money, what is labor, and so forth. Because what is data? That's not been done in this sort of context. Henrik says there, saving money is part of the argument from the public sector. You're getting ahead of me, Henrik. I'm getting there. Slow down. So basically, and going back to your comment here, Henrik, well, of course, one of the reasons why we sort of why we see AI and RPA and Internet of Things is that the public sector wants to save money, or at least, I'm going to come back to that, make things more effective. However, this process of using data in order to sort of achieve imaginary or achieve sort of a goal of the public sector, of course, is nothing new. It sort of goes back to the early beginnings of the public sector, going back to sort of Babylon. Because as long as there has been somebody in charge of somebody else in sort of a societal order, there's been a need to structure information about the subjects. I mean, the sovereign needs to know things about the people that are being controlled. And I mean, this is a body of research from science and technology studies and the studies of numbers that goes back way back. But I mean, there is this long tradition of the public administration establishing bodies of information. What you see here on the left are tablets on tax tablets, basically, how much grain people in the old Mesopotamia owed the king, which is basically data. It's structured information around citizens. And the different forms of artifacts, the materials that we've been using for structuring information, paper forms, registers, records, it's designed as mechanisms for the public administration's work and purpose. And we have sort of this dynamic between controlling citizens. I mean, not necessarily in a malevolent way. We don't want to be, not because we want to be autocrats necessarily, but because there is a need. I mean, whenever you do politics and whenever you deal with power, you control. But also in a democracy, a matter of accountability. One of the reasons we keep records and we keep data is that we can keep the public administration accountable if things go wrong. And here we can look at sort of the work of Weber, which is, I mean, of course, a foundation for how we have structured a lot of the welfare organizations, at least in the Nordic countries. And Weber, how he sort of viewed the role of documents. I mean, we talk a lot about the bureaucrat when we talk about Weber, but he was sort of obsessed with documents and documentation and how we should do documentation. And a lot of his viewpoints are so present today in how we sort of react or frame these artifacts. So that also became sort of a basis for when we started to have digital structured information, because there is also this shift. It actually starts in sort of the 1930s when we have the first whole cards. And some United States government agencies started with digital data record holdings in the 30s. But sort of in the 50s and 60s, we sort of see the first steps towards a digital public sector infrastructure. Henrik asks, Weber being Max Weber? Yes, Max Weber from Prussia. who actually is interesting. It's a figure for modernity, and then I'm going to step aside and talk about something else. Most of his most brilliant ideas he got after he burnt himself out. He worked too hard, and then he sort of collapsed, and sort of started to talk about, why do people work so much? Why don't we work less? I mean, the promise has been that technology will help us work less, but hey, here I am, a professor, and I'm working my ass off. And that was sort of a moment of a realization for Weber, which became sort of his claim to talking about efficiency. We need to make public organizations more efficient so that we can work less. I don't know if that has came to fruition. However, in the 50s, we started to structure data in sort of the early first systems of databases systems, and which has, I mean, a clear lineage from 3500 BC. It's about control and accountability, but now we have that wider forms of processing. Then moving on to the 80s and 90s, we also see that these centers of calculation, we had like central databases where a few people looked at data, gets sort of dispersed when the personal computer, or at least the office computer, makes office staff and even nurses and school personnel digital, which is sort of a step that I talked to my mom around this. She's a nurse, or a retired nurse, and she said that I can't even remember how we used to be nurses before there were computers. Obviously, almost half of her career was without a computer, but it was sort of her memory of that has sort of just faded away. So there is sort of this entrance of data-driven technology into the grassroots level of the organization. And then, of course, I mean, with the internet, we see an additional stage, meaning that the citizens are then, of course, also digital or producing data. What I want to point at here is not only the lineage of data in the public administration, that it's always been there, that it's followed sort of this progression between control and accountability, but also its proximity to commercial logics. Because although Weber, in all his good intent, were very much focused on sort of having if not a democratic baseline, but at least a baseline of legitimacy, digital, or I mean, a democratic legitimacy. When he looked at how to structure and operate the public sector, he looked to industry. He looked at guys like Taylor, who is the sort of instigator of scientific management, which later on transformed into lean, and also looked at Henry Fayol, who was a mining engineer from France, who in the 1890s was the first person to talk about the administration in sort of organizational way. You know, these organizational charts when you put the director at the top and then you have middle management and then workers. Fayol invented that, and Weber loved it. He thought that this is how we need to structure it. If we want to have an effective public sector, we need to look at industry. Industry has the modern, of course, industrialized industry from the late 1800s. I mean, it has a starting point, a middle, and an end. And that's how we should structure things. And this sort of dynamic between commercial actors pushing both technology, but also the mindset around organizations, and how that affects the public sector, then moves sort of along in our data-driven, in the data-driven age. So if we sort of see from the early days of the big sort of centers of calculations with big databases in an office, usually in the capital of a city, towards where we are today, there's sort of been this move where different companies have pushed technology towards a certain area or a certain perspective, and that then has been sort of translated into the public administration. Okay, what can we do with this technology? And a lot of this I think are kind of good. I think we need to bear in mind specifically sort of these companies that has been only focused on the needs of the public administration only started to pop up like 15 years ago. This is a long history. It's a 60-year-old history, but sort of the organization, the organizations that only viewed the public administration are fairly young. And if you're old in the game and you remember companies like VM, Data, and so forth, I mean, they took how they sold data systems for big processing plants and just mimicked it and sold it to the public administration. So basically, the public administration inherited a sort of process industry logic for how to handle data. And this is now carrying on into sort of, now we're moving into sort of a post-Silicon Valley era, I would say. But it sort of moves in that we draw inspiration and we draw ontology and perspectives of the world from these from companies in order to try to understand what can we do with, let's say, algorithmic technology. But going back to an original question around what does it mean for the public administration? Well, we talk sometimes about backpacks. That, I mean, we come with sort of a history of technological inheritance, which sometimes screws it up for the public administration. And you can sort of, if you go back in history, detect sort of the puzzle pieces where some of the questions that we still grapple with in, let's say, regional healthcare or municipalities, they can sort of be tracked into this timeline. I mean, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, I mean, that's when the public administration started to manage digital data. That's one puzzle piece. How do we do that? How do we sort of operate within the foundation, the Weberian foundation, which is obviously there, and our obligations towards the citizens in creating data. And then moving on to sort of the new public management era, 80s and 90s, then we sort of get a digital data practice. It was not only sort of the analytical personnel centralized who did stuff, but also, I mean, nurses and doctors and administrators. All of a sudden, everybody was working with data. And then in sort of the era of the internet, citizens became digital. So a lot of puzzle pieces here happening in sort of a dialogue with commercial understandings of what data is. And where we sort of are at now is that we're still grappling with these puzzle pieces. How should we store data? I mean, what does it mean to work together with citizens in sort of a digital level or with digital citizens? And how do we sort of take the different forms of professions that we have within the public sector and make them work digitally? And what should come first? I mean, should the care situation or the data situation come first? These are puzzle pieces that we're still grappling with, while at the same time, we are looking forward, CDOs saying, hey, now we're implementing AI, now we're implementing this and this and this, without having sort of the basic structures needed to be in place. If you look at these companies, I mean, they're not 100 years old. Their data is just 10 years old. Their systems are not even 10 years old. But here, when we talk about the public administration, we talk about, I would argue, 1,000-year-old lineage around how the sovereign and the citizens share common interests in data, which is sort of an interesting feeding ground for a capitalist logic, because if there is sort of uncertainty, then there is a tradition of people coming in and saying, I can solve this. So from a democratic perspective, what does it mean for the ontology of a data-driven public sector that we're in this sort of mix-up? We have some people saying, let's go. There's only one way, it's forward. There is no left and right in digitalization. We do this. And then there's also this realization that, well, we have a long history of working with data, and we haven't sort of sorted out everything. So I want to sort of chisel out three main things that I see that it means for like the ontology, or I would say rather two things that it means. First of all, it feeds into this digital socio-technical imaginary where democracy is peripheral. We have a vision of what we want to do, but democracy is not necessarily included in that. And also it justifies a non-democratic datafication of citizens. And I'm going to get back to that term later on. So when I say that this sort of situation that we're in this mismatch between history and expectations. The social technical imaginaries can be, see, Henrik Passman, for some Swedish context on the issue, Static Sweden's first cause of a death register is kind of 79. Yeah, definitely. One of the first public healthcare records was actually a leprosy record kept in Norway in the 1820s. So we have a really, really long history of indexing illness and death in the Nordic countries, which of course goes back to a long tradition of control. Talking about the socio-technical imaginaries, when I say that sort of this situation feeds into a specific form of socio-technical imaginary, what do I mean? Well, almost more than 10 years ago, Jasanoff and Kim wrote a compilation called The Dreamscapes of Modernity, which it basically frames what a socio-technical imaginary is, and it goes back to a tradition of science and technology studies. But basically what it is a collective imaged form of social life and social order reflected in the design and fulfillment of technological projects. When somebody says, here is a perfect place to build a house, a sort of idea has been put up. And then the more we start to talk about the design and architecture and the function and the role that this house will play, the more real it gets. And eventually it's going to become so real in a sort of collective mindset that, I mean, it's the only way. It becomes, I mean, the default logic in ontology. And here, it's very obvious that that's what's happening in a lot of the discussions and discourses around data within the public administration, and that is very much shaped of sort of a neoliberal or at least capitalist logic of what data could and should be. One way of seeing this, if you look at socio-technical imaginaries and data, is how many different public actors say that data will solve this problem. Aging population, data will solve this problem. Children, young people and children are having mental health issues. Data will solve this problem. You can look at what's being funded by Vinnova. You can look at sort of the OECD and the innovation playbook, and data is sort of the remedy for all these problems. And that's also, you can see it in a lot of projects popping up around, let's say, AI, that, well, this is going to solve this problem. We're going to do this. A lot of these problems, or a lot of these projects, have super good intentions. But the problem is that you create such a strong socio-technical imaginary of this solution, which is often being sort of referenced towards, look at what's being done at Facebook. They can do this, or look at what's being done in the public sector. Not realizing that you have this baggage of a long history of data work that needs to sort of be addressed. And going back to your comment there, Henrik Passman, around saving money, one of these socio-technical imaginaries of what data could do is very obvious right now. This is in Swedish, I'm sorry about that, but this is a news bulletin from Region Värmland in Sweden, where they say that, oh, we're going into rough times economically, and we're gonna do things about it. We're gonna take precautions, and they talk about what needs to be done in order to balance the budget. And one of the things that's being mentioned by Peter Bäckstrand, which I have nothing but respect for, he's an old colleague, but we're gonna work more with digitalization. Why? Why is that? And the same goes for a lot of other. I've seen municipalities, and I've seen even companies going out and say, well, now we need to intensify digitalization. Although, as I said, there are a lot of things that haven't been sorted out around the concept of data and what it is, we still want to speed up. And the reason we want to do that, and that's of course what you pointed to, Henrik, is that a socio-technical imaginary that's extremely strong within the public sector is that digitalization equals more efficiency. We're gonna be more effective if we do this. There is a report that came out 2 years ago, made by some colleagues of mine in Gothenburg, the University of Gothenburg, looking at digital strategies of Swedish municipalities. And what they sort of conclude is, well, the average digitalization strategy of a Swedish municipality is focused on internal efficiency rather than improved service to residents. Data is being used to save money, because saving money is the objective that we're all agreed upon. That's an imaginary that we need to lower cost. It's also a very convenient form of of data. I mean, numbers. And, but also it speaks sort of to catering to the user's needs is secondary. I mean, democratic discussion about how does the public sector serve value to the citizens becomes secondary here. The same, there's a report called Digitalizing and Strategies. The same research group did on regions. And if you take Region Värmland, for instance, when this research group looked at Region Värmland's policies, I mean, well, their digital policies focus on efficiency and internal work, basically, which is not unique for Region Värmland. This is how we sort of created an idea of what digitalization will do. It will save many. Christian Norling, there we go. Good to have you here, Christian. Thank you for a brilliant report. I use it a lot. So, but what we can basically then see here that Christian and a lot of people points to is, I mean, internal efficiency is sort of a socio-technical imaginary. We're going to make things more effective because that's what we talk about in middle management and management groups within the public administration. And that, of course, means that guys like Taylor and guys like Fiol are sitting back and thinking, yeah, this is industry. This is, I mean, they're getting their, we're paying our dues to these guys, although we don't really talk about them every day. But there is sort of this discrepancy here where democratic values that we should, or at least we think that we uphold, are very much limited in this understanding. And secondly, I think that this sort of ontology around data also then justifies undemocratic datafication of citizens. And what I mean here, datafication is a term that was coined by Coquier and Meyer Schoenberg 10 years ago, but it builds on a long tradition of data studies and science and technology studies. So basically, datafication is not the same as digitalization. Digitalization is taking analog content and making it digital, but datafication is a broader activity. It's taking all aspects of life and turning them into data. And we talked a little bit about this earlier when we mentioned sort of this surveillance capitalist perspectives. I have a colleague with a smartwatch who uses it whenever he goes running, and he forgot to put it on when he did a jog during a lunch break the other week, and he came back and was like, damn it, I didn't register the run. Now it was all for nothing. Because obviously for him, the point was not getting exercise, the point was getting the data. And that's sort of an indication of what datafication is. It is sort of this expectation that every aspect of life should be measured, evaluated, and converted into machine-readable symbols. That we did a workshop a few months ago where somebody said, there's no idea of having playgrounds if we don't measure how much children use them. We should have sensors in the slides. Now it seems like a crazy idea, but in the same way, Pokemon Go or Tinder would have seemed like a crazy idea from a data point of view 20 years ago. It's a question about normalization. And there is a lot of organizations specifically representing both minority groups and disadvantaged groups, but also in research context that sort of points to that the normalization of this data ontology undermines democratic principles. Data for Black Lives is one of them who wants to abolish big data, saying that big data is a myth and big data is only there to sort of to penalize the people who are represented in the data, which is usually people who come in contact with social services or people who are sick, so forth. Kalle says there, going to the chat, when doing a lot of interviews a few years ago with citizens who had relations to the social service in municipalities, almost everyone said things like, I give all my personal data to Facebook because Facebook makes my life easy to manage and it's fun. I would gladly give all my data to the public sector if they could make my life easier, but they don't. All their digital services are impossible to use. I see it as some kind of catch-22 towards public sector digitalization. We don't have the amount of data to build seamless digital public services, and the citizens won't allow us to use their data just because the services are crap. I think, as you said, Petter, we need some kind of political debate broadly in society about the future of digital society could be. Thank you, Kalle. Maria also writes, it reminds me of saying, what you imagine, you become. Yeah, definitely. How to democratize whose imagination is out there to create a future society that's not based on a few people's wishes and dreams. Thank you very much, Maria. I'm going to get back to both of your comments, but sort of this normalization of datafication is something that we already know very well in the public sector, because that happened during the new public management. Everything should be measured. Everything should be controlled. The internal audits, so also the external expertise that, I mean, we take people from outside to tell us what the truth is. So here it becomes sort of new public management on steroids. Although a lot of people say we need to abolish new public management, this form of datafication and the normalization of datafication goes into speeding things up rather than slowing things down when it comes to collecting data and measuring things. Way back in 2006, there was an article called "New Public Management is Dead, Long Live Digital Era Governance," where Duvali et al. Basically said that, well, you think that new public management is going to end because people are sick of recording things, but wait until the digitalization kicks in. And they were right, because now all of a sudden, as you said, Kalle, we want more data. But what does that then entail? That we're going to measure a lot more. And I think one of the things, and I'm going to get back to that later on, is how we define data, because how we define data is very much shaped by a commercial understanding. Data is machine readable ones and zeros. But people's experience, on the other hand, we're not sure what that data is, but maybe that should have a conceptualization that would be fitting for the public administration. I got a quote a few weeks ago from a health center manager who said, "Everybody knows it. Though we measure more and more, there's no way the data in the system gives justice to the patient's needs and state of mind. We just measure anyways, and we use the numbers anyways." What this quote, I would say, basically tells us is that data becomes an empty signifier. Every Friday, data from Cosmic in diff or whatever journal system you use is feed up to Socialstyrelsen in Sweden and into national registers. But the people on the ground, the nurses and doctors, know that this data means nothing. This is just, some data might mean something, but a lot of it doesn't mean anything. So data becomes sort of a research dictated by the epistemology of others. What can we do with it? And one of the reasons I think this is important, if the data doesn't really represent users, or it becomes this empty signifier, it becomes an interesting question when we go towards more and more data-driven language processing tools, which depends on data. Even if the data that OpenAI uses, if that data doesn't mean anything, if it was just something that the nurse put in, what will sort of happen when we integrate APIs from OpenAI into search engines and eventually into journal systems? If the data is crap, what will then happen with these systems? So that, I think, is a fairly important question to talk about, because I do believe that AI systems will be very beneficial. But if the data is crap, I'm not sure that it will be beneficial, especially if the data is generated outside of sort of an idea of what democracy should be. So I think that this is sort of the ontology of data in the data-driven public sector at the moment. It feeds into the social technical imaginaries that we can save money, make us more efficient, but also it justifies sort of an undemocratic use of citizens' data, both implicitly and explicitly. So going back to sort of the question about data as a resource, how is data defined and understood as a resource and mechanisms in the welfare? Not conceptualized. I mean, we're not sure what it is. It could be many different things, and maybe that is good. But one thing that we know is that it's usually seen as sort of a universal remedy. It's going to solve a lot of things. We're not sure what it is, but it's going to solve a lot of things. Also, we have sort of this default dynamic of individualization. We sort of assume that the subject is the individual. The subject for digitalization and data-driven services are never the family or the community, but it's the individual, which sort of also speaks into a neoliberal idea of value, how that's created. Also prediction, we want to predict things. I see that all the time. How can we predict what will be good and bad, instead of talking about how can we use it for critique? And the idea of right decisions, of course. And someone else is also the data expert. I usually ask questions when I do research, who is the data expert? And point to someone else. And usually the people who work the most with data, which is usually the nurses who feed in the data, never see themselves as data experts. And also, and this, I'm going to leave that for another time, but the means of production here, I mean, which is obviously a conceptualization that's been very important for our understanding of economy and labor as resources. The means of production are not the production anymore, because the production of data happens in a setting where we sort of forget that it happened there. I'm going to leave that for another theoretical discussion, perhaps in the seminar later on. I'm going to wrap up really quickly with talking a little bit about, okay, if this is the case, that we're in a state where we haven't really sorted out what data is for the public sector. There is a capitalist logic that, of course, could sort of be instigated or used in order to sort of remotely solve the things. How can you sort of resist it? And what role should design play in that perspective? I'm going to draw from three books that I enjoy, two books that I've read a lot of times, and one book that I've only read once. The book that I only read once, I'm going to start with, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's by Otto von Busch and Carl Palmos. It came out a few weeks ago, called The Corruption of Co-Design, which is basically a kick in the balls to contemporary service designers, telling them what they should have heard a long time ago, and I'm included that. I had a lot of stomachache reading that book. Then talking a little bit from Caring Democracy by John C. Tronto, and lastly, I'm going to talk about All Data Are Local. But basically, what these three books say is stop doing design, in italic. Stop doing democracy and stop doing data. And not, of course, I mean, not stop it totally, but stop doing what you think is design, democracy, and data. So what Otto von Busch and Palmos talk about in their book is sort of designers in general, but in the public sector, sort of need to acknowledge the sort of second order hypocrisy of design and the system that surrounds it. That designers go around and work a lot with empathy, and work a lot with participation, and work a lot with sort of this participatory elements, but a lot of time do manipulation, when manipulate people in order to think things. And the design community in general is very homogeneous. It's people ages 25 to 45 who wants to have sort of a social liberal solutions, and people who actually are rather political but don't go into politics. When those people move into the public sector organizations, they either get sort of disillusioned, what should I do? Or they do what von Busch and Palmos call second order hypocrisy. I mean, you manipulate people, although you don't say you do it. And there's a really fun small chapter called How to Be a Better Hypocrite in this book, where it talks about, well, you need to sort of facilitate change. To facilitate change, you need real design. And by real design, they refer back to real politics. You need to see the politics that is in design. You can't go around and think that doing workshops and doing fluffy stuff will just make things change. And also that democracy is more than participatory practice. It's a statecraft. I mean, as we saw with the children and the violin in the beginning, there are winners and losers. See, Ferg has written, there's a lot of questions in the chat now. I'm going to save them for later if it's okay. So I'm going to wrap up. There's this really nice quote from the book, from this chapter, where they talk about it. Even though empathy and participation are work the foundations to start from, such workshops should not distract our views from the fact that design does not necessarily empower the disempowered. The point is that designers should be sincere about the roles that they play and make that they and the mask that they wear. Their good intentions will not save them from betrayal or corruption or acting like hypocrites to some degree. Basically, taking politics to design, and also sort of acknowledging that there is no sort of magic bullet here, but you can't be a conventional public servant, and you can't be sort of only a workshop facilitator. If you truly want to go back to the roots of design, which was disruptive, then you sort of also need to acknowledge the politics. Some lessons from Caring Democracy from John C. Tronto, which is a brilliant book. is that, I mean, in everything we do in design practices, and specifically then if we go into data-driven processes, is to put the emphasis on care and not on economic production. Because that is always sort of the scapegoat for any data-driven project or any digital project. It's gonna save resources. But I would love to see a project where they go in and says, this is gonna be terribly expensive. It's gonna cost a lot of money, but God damn it, it's gonna be good for people's well-being. I've never heard a project like that where they say it's gonna be super expensive but good for people's well-being. It's always been, it's gonna be good for people's well-being and it's gonna save money, which is usually never the case. John Tronto also argues, not specifically related to data, but in general, that you need to see people as vulnerable and interdependent and not as autonomous. This sort of neoliberal idea that people are rational individuals, and if we provide them with digital solutions, they're going to solve things themselves. That is the basis for creating inequality in a digital and data-driven public administration, because we depend on our family and we depend on our community, and the more vulnerable we get, the more we depend on them, and that's why we need to sort of design towards another form of subject than the individual, and also then acknowledging that logics and modernity represent one form of rationality. I mean, what we think is rational is very much a modern construct. I mean, rationality should and could be many other things as well. And one thing here is that we should sort of talk about reclaiming the narrative, the thick data, as a part of data-driven discourse, because now data is still this vague idea of big data. I'm not even sure we should talk about big data. Big data is sort of big data at a volume when it becomes, when we become anxious when using it. It's a quote used by Campbell. So accept that narratives are also important data in digitalization. And lastly, a book that I really recommend is All Data Are Local by Lucasis. It doesn't contribute with anything new theoretically. If you've read your science technology studies, you're gonna see a lot of things that you have seen before, but it puts it down into really, really specific and applied perspectives. So always acknowledge that data have complex attachment to place. I mean, the idea that data from 50 different healthcare centers will be homogeneous is stupid, because all the different healthcare centers work differently. Data are produced and reproduced, not mined or harvested. This idea that the data is just out there and we could go and pick it. There's a lot of decisions being made in what data is being used, and you, as a designer, are sort of in charge of that. And also account for negative space, which is not represented, and also the view data as indexes to local knowledge instead, and use data to build relations. Specifically, I mean, don't use data to predict. Use data to feed it back to the ones who were there when it was produced, and ask them, does this really represent what happened? How should we go forward with this? How should we facilitate a discussion around what could be done, instead of sort of using this sort of streamlined idea? And you're not doing the right thing just because you have good intentions or good algorithms. And I think this goes back to sort of the idea that, I mean, what was right in the situation with the children and violin? I think we all had different ideas of what was right. But if we don't have politicians, decision makers that have been elected by their constituents who make decisions, if they keep pushing down political decisions onto the people working within the public administration, then of course there's going to be a discrepancy on how democratic principles work. And I think that is a core thing to be aware of whenever designing for data-driven services within the public sector, that you're not going to solve anything. We have politicians because there are dilemmas in society, and democracy is a way of solving dilemmas. It's a way of governing. It's not a way to make everybody happy. And if we think that data is going to make everybody happy, then sorry to say, I don't think it will work, but the capitalist logic might tell you so. I'm wrapping up, and we have a few minutes for questions. I know that I've sort of lost track from the chat, but Kalle, do you have any abilities when it comes to facilitating questions, or should we just open up the floor?
Of course, I think there have been a lot of writing in the chat, and I think it's been a lot about this. What about, shouldn't we have some kind of democratic discussion about should we be able to use data, and how should we be able to use the data from the public sector? And I also do think it's some kind of questions about the free data. Can municipalities open up their data systems with the data that is not within the personal data? And I think that some of the municipalities already have done that with the thought that that might create billions of new apps and services from the private sector. But I think that maybe Fergus had some kind of long answer, I think, or question. Maybe I will open up to Fergus to state that to everybody.
Hopefully not too hopefully not too long. And it was really just building on your comment around the idea that people are happy to give their data if things are perceived to be fun or the interface is engaging. And it was really just this question about how, if we're serious about democratic services or providing or creating democratic institutions in the public sector, how we need to make visible and make fun and sexy more than just the interface. That we really need to open up the back-end data structures and services and somehow make them accessible to everybody if we want everybody to understand how they function and perceive their value. So it was I don't know if that's a particularly coherent point, but it was very much building on what you said, Kalle, that we're disadvantaged now because people are looking for hedonistic benefit, and that's the main thing that they value. And a lot of the work that designers do is at that superficial front end. And we probably aren't doing enough, in my opinion, at least, to also make accessible, make visible, enhance the aesthetic of all the boring but absolutely essential services that the public sector does provide daily for people. But they say they're not happy to give their data to support because it's not as fun as Facebook. So how we solve that problem was a sort of question, really, I had for everyone here. Yeah.
It's a very good question. Thank you for, and I don't really know if I have an answer. We have been doing some interesting projects where we sort of looked at the data view of practitioners. How much of the data do they see? And basically, they only see the data that goes into the system, and looked at how can we broaden their view on data. Taking data scientists to visit them at the healthcare center and talk about how does the data flow in the system. And we're in a process now where we sort of want to take nurses and doctors from a local healthcare center and have them at least sort of thematically access the data storage facilities and enter sort of where the reports are being made in order to sort of shorten the distance from this, as you said, the interface and where data is sort of turned into knowledge. And I think that's a very much an organizational journey, but super good point, Fergie. And I don't know if I answered it, but yeah.
No,
Kalle, do you have any?
Yeah. You certainly did, Petter, and I think it's something we all need to work with. So thank you so much for your inspiration today and sort of setting all this thing up. It was very much, I wasn't looking for anyone to have one answer to that, more something I think we all need to talk about more, like you're saying, and work together to make sure it happens. Yeah.
I see Henrik has one question. Let's have this as the last question before we end this seminar. But Henrik, you had a question, please.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Petter, for a very interesting lecture, and also thank you to Fergus for bringing up your question. As a public sector employee, I find it very interesting. I was thinking about something because I'm an epidemiologist by trade, and we have worked with data for very long. Something that I have noticed in the recent developments with how we use data in the public sector and everywhere else, really, is what I, for lack of a better term, call the erosion of epistemology and method. And what I mean by that is, when I learned epidemiology, maybe I'm old-fashioned. What we learned is that basically looking at data without having any any previous idea of what you're looking for. What was then called data fishing has now basically, it's now been elevated to sort of the data holy grail, because you hope to solve problems by just throwing huge amounts of data, often called big data, but no one really knows what that is. And then a pattern turns up and you really don't know why, or in many cases even how, because you don't know the model. And I don't know about you, but for me that's very unnerving. What do you think about that, Petter, and for that matter, everyone else?
Yeah, and a brilliant comment, Henrik, and I can only agree with you that, as I said, we sort of have moved towards data science being sort of this wizard that will sort of solve problems for us. And I see that exactly the same trend in both municipalities, in regions, where you create what Bruno Latour would call centers of calculations, where you feed the data in, and then the expertise you have there is primarily statistic and mathematical. It has nothing to do with the data context. It doesn't bring data back to the local context. And I think here, I mean, there is a lot to learn from sort of medical science. I don't say that often, but but I truly think that, because then there you have sort of an idea of the lab and its possibilities and limitations. You don't really have that if you only work with the data, if you never go to the lab. So.
And
thank you very much.
Just to sort of wrap that up, that also ties into the inherent weaknesses of observational studies vis-a-vis experimental setups, really.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, it's going to be the children and the violin. What's right, and who's going to solve this dilemma? And is it going to be sort of forces that we acknowledge and see ideologically? I know left and right, I know what to vote for. Or should it be sort of this slow and intrinsic sort of social cultural movement that we're doing?
Yeah, thank you very much, Petter. I think, well, that is the last comment for today, and I think we have you have opened up some really interesting discussions, and I think we need, as you always say, some kind of more societal debate about what is data, how should we use data in the public sector, out from a democratic perspective. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you, Petter, for the eminent presentation.